I'm Brian Connolly, Club Vice President. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Emily Alderton. The ink is just barely dry on her PhD. She officially just got it last week. So round of applause. But it's not every day you get to introduce a speaker who has tattoos of Podmageddon on her arms. She has natans and pectinata, so it's pretty awesome. But let's see, Emily is a native of West Sussex, England, and she has her bachelor's, which was in zoology, master's in aquatic science, and her PhD in ghost ponds from the University College of London. And she's interested in the ecological interactions of just sort of human activities and their effects on plants and the environment. She also has picked a very good day to talk about ghost ponds, it being Friday the 13th, so it's a very spooky topic. But with that, and
I told her I tried to find ghost cookies.
And Emily actually came to the club's attention because she went on a plant walk with Pat Swain in Pepperell, Mass. This summer, and Carol Frost said, "You should get Emily. She's awesome. She has this great topic, and she has a British accent, so she'll be fun to listen to." So, without any further ado, Emily, please take it away.
I can perform on at least one of those fronts. I don't know how brilliant the topic's going to be, but hopefully it'll be interesting. So today I thought I'd talk to you a bit about some of my research from my PhD, which is on the subject of ghost ponds, and I'll get into what those are shortly. I've tried to put more of a botanical spin on it because I realise I'm speaking to a botany club, but if I go into too much detail about, I don't know, GIS or landscape change, just heckle and I'll move on. So I thought I'd start off with just a quick introduction to what ponds in the UK are like in general, what sort of size, what sort of plant life we're talking about, and then I'll go into more detail about what these ghost ponds are and why they're of interest to us in terms of habitat and conservation. Oh, thank you. So first of all, what is a pond? Well, so we don't really have a great working definition of what a pond is. The most commonly used definition in the UK is a body of standing water, temporary or permanent, man-made or natural, anywhere between 1 metre and 2 hectares, which is, I would think, usually a small lake at that point. But so in terms of the sort of things I'm talking about when I'm talking to you about ghost ponds are things that look a bit like this sort of size, like a fairly small body of water, usually have the potential to have aquatic plants growing right across at all depths. As I said, so in the UK we've got a wide variety of ponds of different origins. Most of them are man-made. All of the ones in these photos, for instance, are old marl pits, which is where in agricultural land they tended to dig down to get to the marl clay subsoil, which was a good fertiliser and soil conditioner to then be spread on the fields. Obviously once you've dug your pit, it then eventually just fills up with rainwater and you get these ponds all across the countryside. Of course, then you also have things like mill ponds for running mills, livestock ponds for watering cattle, dew ponds in the chalk land, which were for watering sheep specifically. And then, of course, a few ponds of natural origins, things like glacial pingo relics and oxbow lakes. But the majority of small ponds are man-made in origin. But they've become a very important part of the sort of aquatic habitats of the UK. So this is a little map of pond density in the UK. As you can see, there's quite a few hotspots. So this is around Norfolk and Suffolk in East Anglia. This is the area where I've been working from, so the sort of pondiest regions. You also get high densities of ponds, particularly down in sort of Kent and Essex, and then again up here in Cheshire and Lancashire. So we used to have, it's estimated, Oliver Rackham in his History of the Countryside looked at old maps from the start of the 20th century and estimated there used to be about 800,000 ponds in the UK. Since then, the Department for Transport and Regions commissioned a lowland pond survey At that point, in the late 1990s, they estimated that the number of ponds in England and Wales was down to just over 200,000, 230,000. So there's been quite a significant loss of these habitats. Despite the fact that we've lost a lot of them, and this is something that's happened right across Europe and I'm sure as well in North America, especially as a result of agricultural intensification, a lot of these small wetlands and ponds have been filled in and converted often to agricultural land use. So despite the fact that there's far fewer than there used to be, ponds still account for about 97% of all standing waters in the UK. But because of their small size, that equates to only about 14% of the total water area. So they're a very numerous habitat. Not only are they very numerous, but they're very diverse, both in terms of invertebrates and in terms of plants. This is a paper by Williams et al. In 2004, where they were looking at different freshwater habitats across Europe. And they found that ponds tended to disproportionately contribute to biodiversity at a regional scale, because you have lots of very small, isolated habitats that were very different from each other. And at the regional level, again, they support more rare species than any other habitat. So you can see that rivers tend to perform a bit better in terms of species richness, but they're obviously much larger, more connected habitats. Ponds, you've got a much smaller and more heterogeneous dynamic going on there. Despite their importance for biodiversity and their numerousness in the countryside, they tend to be neglected by legislation. We've got a lot of freshwater directives that protect lakes and protect rivers and large water bodies. There's very little protection or attention paid to ponds. Despite this, they support a lot of the rare and protected species in the UK. So this is an excerpt from, oh, it's cropped off the bottom. That poor of me. Oh no, sorry, from Williams et al., 1998. This was the Lowland Pond Survey of the UK. Just gives you an idea of some of these. So these are species that are protected by the Wildlife and Countryside Act. A wide variety of fish and invertebrates and plants, many of which are found almost exclusively in ponds. And these are all given protection within the UK. So to highlight a few, I just thought I'd pick out a few that occur in the area that I've been studying, Norfolk. So I shall focus on the plants particularly. So things, for instance, like Caricanescens, which is a charophyte stoneworts, like a macroalgae. This is found across Europe, and I think it's also found in Canada and the Great Lakes, I believe, as well. In the UK, it's considered endangered, and it does tend to be found occasionally in farmland ponds in Norfolk, which is where I've been working. Other rare species that we find there, things like the hollyleaf naiad, Naias marina. Again, this is a species which is classified as vulnerable within the UK. It's restricted pretty much only to Norfolk in the Broads and one pond that I know of, and it appeared in that pond after we restored it. This is something I'll return to a bit later. Yeah, sorry. And another one that we get within the Norfolk area, that exists in some of the farmland ponds, but again threatened, Apium repens, the creeping marshwort. This is an interesting species, because it used to exist in Norfolk and East Anglia, but it's now restricted pretty much only to Oxfordshire, right in the centre of the country. It's an endangered species, and then this brings up some interesting questions about, well, it used to be in Norfolk and it used to be in some of these other regions. So what happens where we have these ghost ponds and these ponds that we've become overgrown or have been filled in, and the seed bank for these sort of species that have been lost from those areas? This is an idea I shall return to shortly. So that's a little brief, tiny little introduction to what I mean by a pond, I suppose, when I'm talking about. Here you seem to have a very different scale of pond quite often. So just to give an idea of the smallness of what I'm discussing. So in particular, I'm going to now focus on the farmland ponds of Norfolk. As I said, a lot of these originated as marl pits that were dug, well, right up until the start of the 19th century, really, until commercial fertilisers became a big deal. And these farmland ponds are often neglected. People tend to think, oh, a farmland pond's going to be, well, something like this bottom row here, where you've got something that's very eutrophic and nutrient enriched and just becomes an algal soup. Something very overgrown that pretty much all the water in that has disappeared now, it's just a thicket. Or something where the farmers ploughed right up to the edge and tipped a load of rubble in and generally trashed the area. But they can be really quite beautiful, like the top two. Again, these are just located in normal intensive farmland, not a special organic farm or a conservation-minded farm in particular. It's just that they haven't ploughed quite right up to the margin. And you get some really spectacular habitats there. So as well as the sort of threats you might think of to a pond that still exists, like the nutrient enrichment, the pollution, the tipping, probably one of the biggest threats to ponds in the UK and a lot of other regions in Europe is being infilled and converted over to agricultural land. So as I mentioned before, the UK estimated that the number of ponds has dropped from about 800,000 to just over 200,000. In Norfolk, there's currently around 22,000 ponds left, but that's about a 30% loss from what was there in the 1950s. Almost all of these are in farmland, agricultural areas. As you can see, it still represents one of the high sort of pond density spots in the country. So this is where I've been working, partly because there's a lot of ponds still there, but also because there's an awful lot of ponds that have been lost, which I can then study. So this is just a little map of to show pond densities across Norfolk now, zooming in on that county. So this is just a heat map to show, you can see in the 1950s, this is based on the old Ordnance Survey maps. This central region in particular had quite high densities of ponds, more than 20 ponds per kilometre square. By the 2000s, you've got significant sort of fragmentation of this aquatic resource, much more patchy, sporadic numbers of ponds, and generally that whole area has been reduced to more like 10 ponds kilometre square with a few hot spots. So what does this look like on the ground? If we zoom in on this little patch here, this is around the village of Wood Dooling. So this is a modern OS map of Wood Dooling where you can see the ponds, little blue ponds marked. These are the ponds that are still there. And each of those red dots is a pond that was marked on the map in the 1950s but has since been filled in. So a lot of these were filled at the same time that the hedgerows were being ripped out for intensification. So generally what would happen is you tear your hedgerow out, you chuck it in the pond, compact it down, put some topsoil on, and then plant it with whatever you want to grow. So this is an aerial shot of Norfolk, and you can see there's still a lot of ponds here, dotted around the fields, but then you have these little ghostly marks where there used to be something there, and it's since been buried. So these are our ghost ponds. And this is what they look like on the ground. Often you get after a heavy rain, you get a big flooding patch, as you can see in this top photo and here. Sometimes it'd be like a changing crop cover. So this is a patch that floods intermittently, and the crops never do very well there. This one's interesting. This is a ghost pond that used to be on a hedgerow, and this big old oak tree is the only tree that's been left of that row, plus the scar on the ground where the pond used to be. So these are quite a common sight as you're walking around the countryside, and it's got us thinking about what happens to all of the plant life that used to live there, the seed bank, the things that were there, because most of these ponds are too small. They weren't drained, no one bothered, they were just filled in. So anything that used to live there was simply buried and abandoned at that point. So we wanted to know what happens to that seed bank, and can you bring it back? So as I mentioned, like, ghost ponds are abundant across the UK. I've specifically worked in Norfolk. They're abundant across Europe, and I think they're essentially abundant anywhere you have lots of agricultural land. So this is from a report by Dahl on the wetlands of the USA between 1994 and 2004. And some photos he's got from the prairie pothole region, which essentially are describing a very similar thing to what I'm talking about when I say a ghost pond. We've got a wetland, again, specifically like in the UK, that's not being drained, it's just been filled in and ploughed over, and you can see the sort of the remnants, the juncus and the wetland type plants trying to get back in there. In other instances where you do have a field that has been drained, but then in particular heavy rain, you get that, like the wetland trying to come back almost. So to investigate what happens to that seed bank and can you bring it back, what lives there, we used various approaches. So first of all, we found our ghost ponds, our infield former ponds, and we took sediment samples from these. And then these sediments we set up outdoor mesocosms, which were on the field next to the ghost ponds. And this was essentially a series of either open or closed little mini plastic ponds like this. We either put seed sediment in them so that they had a seed bank, or we left them open and had them sterile so that only things could disperse in. In addition to that, sort of to replicate that, we also had a series of microcosms set up. So these were just little plastic aquariums that contained sediment from each of the ghost ponds. And they were kept sealed up so that nothing else could get in there. And then finally, we also conducted a series of like viability testing of seeds, which we sieved out of those historic sediments to test whether they were still alive after various periods of time. And then, of course, in the field, we had the ponds themselves, which we dug out and monitored as they came back to life. So I worked on 3 ghost pond study sites, and they were all buried at different points, very imaginatively named. So Ghost Pond 50 was buried 50 years ago. You have to use your imagination for that one. It was in the middle of this potato field, roughly there. And you could sort of, if I didn't draw the grey circle on, maybe see a dip, but not quite. But anyway, we had Ghost Pond 150, which was buried about 150 years ago. This one was on a hedgerow at the time, rather than out in the middle of the crop field. And Ghost Pond 45, which was buried 45 years ago. Again, another pond in the middle of the field. This one's not been quite as completely buried. We actually spoke to the farmer who did it at the time. He planted potatoes on it, but the potatoes didn't take very well, so he gave up and just let it sort of turn into this patch of stinging nettles and general waste ground. So then, for comparison, in each of these farms where we were working on a ghost pond, we also took an overgrown pond, so that still contained a bit of water and was still sort of a pond, but wasn't doing very well, essentially. So for comparison, to see how the seed banks of these overgrown sites behaved. So these two are both in Guestwick village, completely meaningless to you, but I shall tell you the names anyway. These two are in Westfield, and these two are in Stoddy. So you can see from the state of the overgrown ponds what sort of thing I mean. Like, there's a bit of water left in there, but there's no aquatic plants growing. I think there was Solanum dulcimara, just about clinging on in the shade, and that was pretty much all we had there. So I'm going to focus mostly on the ghost ponds because I guess they're the most exciting novel thing about this, but I will also make reference to the restored pond seed banks as well. So I'll take you on a little photo story of how this process works. So this is Ghost Pond 50 in September 2013. Can you sort of believe me that there's a dip there? Sort of? Okay, so this is what it looked like in 2013 in September. This is my PhD supervisor, Carl. Thank you, Carl, for helping me with all my work. So the first thing we did was dig a trench through that depression. So the ghost ponds are quite easy to find. You get your old survey maps and you can see where they are in relation to the hedgerows. You go out in the field and you can usually match up some sort of dip in the ground to that map. So then what we did is we took a JCB through the centre of that dip to check we were in the right place. You can see the distinct difference between like the topsoil here and then when you hit the old pond sediment underneath, you get this real obvious change. And it still smells like a pond as well if you've ever been in a really silty wetland. But, yeah, as you can probably imagine. So this was the point at which you can see us putting some cores in here. So this is the point at which we extracted some of that sediment to set up our experiments. This is what it looks like, some of that pond mud, so it's quite obvious when you get there. Like I said, you get the colour change. You get all sorts of, you can see all the aquatic, the snail shells and pea mussels preserved in the old pond sediment. These are preserved leaf fragments of the broadleaf pondweed, Potamogeton natans, there, comparison. And even here you can see, so this is a Potamogeton natan seed, which has been pressed and preserved in that mud. So that's how you know when you're in the right place, once you've got your ghost pond. You then all stand around looking useless while someone actually does the work of digging it out, like this. So we dug these ponds out, leaving a lot of this black, the seed bank in the bottom, so that you've got your source for regeneration there. There's me stood in it to give an idea how shallow it is at this moment in time. So this was after about a day's digging. Didn't take too long to clear that pit out. And we pretty much just excavated it following the shape that was marked on the old map and then leaving that seed bank in place. So that was September 2013. Over the winter, these ponds filled quite quickly with water, just from rainfall and the ground water table. So this is in February. There's nothing growing in it much at this point, just filled with water. By May time, it's starting to look a bit algal and unpleasant, and you think, this is going to be horrible. It's never going to do anything interesting. But there are, in fact, you can't see them. Well, there's one submerged species. We've got Cara vulgaris, which is the common stonewort, I think. And the hard rush, Juncus inflexus, just coming up on the margins now, where it's now wet again. So this is May time, so early spring for the UK, pretty much. By June time, the water's starting to clear, and you're starting to get more of a filamentous algal bloom going on. Still not looking very nice. But we've got a bit more diversity under the water. We've got another species of stonewort, Cara globularis, coming in. Lemna minor, that's something that's almost certainly dispersed in rather than coming from the seed bank. And still just the hard rush. You'll notice the margin at this point in time is the previous year's crop of broad beans and borage rather than anything. It does get better, I promise. After a year or so, you start getting wildflowers rather than just old crops. So then by July time that year, starting to look quite nice now. The water's cleared well. We've got thick beds of stonewort right across the pond. First sign of the broadleaf pondweed, Potamogeton natans, now growing in the pond. And by September time that year, so 1 year after it's been dug, quite a diverse list of species, submerged and marginal. Nothing particularly exciting or rare, but some good sort of ecological keystone species. The stoneworts, very good for like stabilising sediment. Important habitat for invertebrates. The broadleaf pondweeds and the other emergent plants provide great habitat for dragonflies as well. So we've got quite a lot of interesting species now visiting there. So this is the 50-year-old ghost pond. That's what that looked like for its first year. Oh, one more, sorry. So this was it 2 years on then. So similar species list, but now really quite dense, thick beds of vegetation. And you can start to see the margins are now becoming a little bit more interesting. You've got the juncus spreading up, starting to get some typha in there, and some more terrestrial plants, which I can't tell you a huge amount about, but no longer just borage and beans, which is nice. Oh, and Ranunculus equatalis flowering in the centre here. So for comparison, just a quick photo story through what a restored pond looks like. So this is in the same field as the ghost pond, this big overgrown pond which has just become a thicket essentially. So this was it in September. Hacking the trees down in September. There's a little bit of water left in there, but not much. Scooping all of the old anoxic sort of sediment that had laid down when the pond became terrestrialised to get back down to sort of the original seed bank layer from when it was an open water habitat. Again, February time, it's filled with water over the winter. And then by June the following year, again, really nice, rich, diverse habitat for aquatic species. I think we've got 5 species of stonewater charophyte submerged, big flowering beds of ranunculus. And also a quite uncommon species in farmland ponds, Urananthia aquatica, the water dropwort, also growing in this site, which was really nice to see. So just to sort of give you an overview, here's a little photo of each of the, so these are the 3 ghost ponds after a year. Around 20-ish species of aquatic or emergent plant have developed. Similar in the restored ponds, again, same sort of levels of diversity and very high species overlap between the two. So the speed with which these sites colonised and the similarity in the species they support gives got a strong suggestion that there's the seed bank role there. But obviously to prove that, we can't say that these things didn't all disperse into here from other neighbouring ponds. So we need to look at the mesocosm and microcosm results. So these are the little mesocosms, these outdoor experiments we set up. So we set them all up around each ghost pond or restored pond. Some of them are covered up with a very fine mesh to keep seeds and birds or dispersal agents out. Some of them are left open. And then they either contain sediment from the pond with a seed bank, or they contain sterile potting soil so that anything to grow in that would have to have dispersed in from outside. And you can see, so here's one of the little mesocosms for the 50-year-old ghost pond. This is a covered one that had sediment from the pond in. Dense populations of natans growing in that, matching the natans growing in the ponds, Botanical natans. This is one of the mesocosms for the 150-year-old ghost pond, thick beds of Chirophyte. I think this is Chira vulgaris probably in this one. Again, matching the species that were also growing in the pond. Oh, no, sorry. So in terms of in these mesocosms that we had set up, ghost ponds and restored ponds followed a fairly similar trajectory in terms of how quickly things started to germinate and what species germinated. Mesocosms that contained pond sediment and were covered up with a mesh so that nothing else could get in there had significantly more species and developed significantly quicker than other treatments. In blue here we have the mesocosms that contain pond sediment but were left open. So initially I was a bit surprised by why those two behaved differently, until I sat and had my lunch by these ones and noticed a lot of ducks came in and ate almost everything at once. So there's quite a lot of animal disturbance going on here. Plus also probably a nice temperature regime going on in the covered ones that helps things grow a bit faster. Then down here, this orange line here is sterile sediment that was left open so that seeds could disperse in. Had very little growing in there. And the red line is our control, which was sterile sediment that was covered, so nothing should have grown in there. This point was a storm in which a lot of them got opened up. So just to prove that nothing really works when you try and do it outside perfectly anyway. But it did, up until the point that they were definitely contaminated, it was going quite well. So this sort of suggests, so here we've got this sediment, sterile sediment that's open. This is sort of mimicking maybe your brand new pond condition if you were going to dig a pond somewhere where there was no seed bank, you've never had a pond before. So you're getting this suggestion that the seed bank does have this role not only in definitely sourcing some of these species, but also could potentially help a pond develop much faster, colonise much quicker than if you just leave it, if it just relies on dispersal entirely. So that's from the mesocosms. And again, so then if we look at the results from the microcosms and some of the seed staining that we did in the lab, so these are our little plastic aquaria that were kept well and truly sealed up. No ducks or storm damage in these cases. And again, we have the same species growing in these that we had growing in the mesocosms that we had growing in the ponds. So the sort of evidence for this seed bank role is mounting up. So this is one of the little tanks from containing sediment from the 50-year-old ghost pond. Again, we've got broadleaf pondweed and chirophytes growing in here. And another tank from the 150-year-old ghost pond. Again, broadleaf pondweed and chirophytes growing. And then in terms of seeds that we extracted from the sediment and tested in the lab, one of them This one here, for instance, a juncus seed from the 150-year-old ghost pond. This grew in my fridge while I was waiting to test it. It didn't wait long enough to be stained, but that proved it was viable, so that was okay. This is a Charophyte spore, so again from the 150-year-old ghost pond. So these have been stained using tetrazolium chloride, which is a colourless compound, reacts with, when it's in metabolizing tissue, creates, it's called formazine, which is this red precipitate. So when a tissue is respiring, it'll stain red. So this shows this oospore here is alive, or was alive until I dissected it and then poisoned it. And these are embryos from Potamogeton natan seeds. Again, so this one here, these are both from the 50-year-old pond sediment. This one here is definitely, or probably viable, like a nice healthy colour stain. This is a possibly iffy one because it's got a bit of a discoloration at one end. But so we're certainly finding the same viable species. So now we've got a nice sort of complete level. We've got seeds that are definitely viable, they grow in tanks, they grow in the field, and then they grow in the ponds as well. So I think overall quite nice conclusive evidence that these ponds do have a viable seed bank, at least for a range of aquatic species. So these are the aquatic submerged species which we found growing in the ponds, and then at least one of those experimental conditions. So various species of stoneworked charophytes, ranging from, so Chara hispida, we only found in the youngest ghost pond. Some of the others, Chara vulgaris and virgata, were in that pond that had been buried over 150 years ago and was still viable. Nitella, which is quite unusual in agricultural ponds again in the UK. We found that viable in one of the ghost ponds. The broadleaf pondweed was viable up to 150 years ago. And one single ranunculus aquaculus seed, which it grew in the pond, the 50-year-old ghost pond. It didn't grow in any of the experiments, but there was one single viable seed from the 150-year-old sediment, again, which grew in my fridge while I was waiting to do stuff with it. Now, this is a fairly short species list. If you look at it, so this is too small for you to read in detail, but this is a list of all of the species that grew, aquatic or marginal species that grew in the ghost or restored ponds. Sorry, I realise I keep standing in front of you. So you can see that these are the species that occurred in the ghost ponds, and then the next column is the restored ponds. Considerable overlap, quite similar species composition between these sites. And then we have meso, which is in the mesocosms. You can see it's just a small subset of those purely submerged species. Microcosms, again, an even smaller subset of those species. Fossil here means that there were preserved seeds in the sediment, but none of them were viable. So these are things that definitely used to live in that pond, but we didn't actually find any viable seeds in the experiment. So obviously the experimental conditions only produced a very small number of the species that were there overall. Now it could be that those were the only viable seeds. It could just be that compared to the volume of mud you have in a large pond basin, when you extract a few litres of it to keep in a greenhouse, you just miss some of these sparser seed banks, and they don't occur in your experiments. And it's also worth bearing in mind I only had 3 of each pond, 3 ghosts and 3 submerged ponds. So I think with a larger sample size, you're likely to find some more interesting rare species, wider diversity of species. But what it did show, which is, well, to me very exciting, because I think this is the first time it's been done for habitats, aquatic ponds that have been completely buried and destroyed and ploughed over and spread with fertiliser and soil compaction, and have been like that for over 100 years in some of these cases. But yet there are still aquatic plants in there that can survive. And more than one species, we've got a range of species coming through. So I think there's real hope and promise there that if you were to do this with more than just 3 ponds, there's a good chance that you can bring back some rare species, species that have been locally lost, species whose habitats have been reduced and fragmented. So, as a few sort of examples or thoughts to perhaps take away, these are some of the species that are found in the local area that are perhaps of interest. First of all, we have Uinanthia aquatica, the fine-leaved water dropwort, which is not a rarity in the UK, but it's fairly uncommon in agricultural areas. It tends to like upland, low nutrient water. This is one growing submerged in one of our restored ponds. And again, the seeds were found fossilised in the sediment. We didn't get any actually coming back in the experiments, but it could just be that there's not that many seeds in there and we missed them. Again, it's found in Norfolk, in the local area, but bringing back some of these ghost ponds where it used to exist could well help fill out that population. It's been restored in 4 ponds, so in total, since I've done this project, I studied 3 ponds that we restored, 3 ghost ponds. Since then, we've done a further 15-ish restored ponds. There's about 20 in total now, and I think about 6 ghost ponds that have been resurrected, if that's the right word. So then closely related to the Oenanthe aquatica, which we know comes back when you restore ponds, Oenanthe fistulosa, the tubular water dropwort. And this is vulnerable in the UK, and it's also a biodiversity action plan species. So if you get this in your nature reserve, you're very happy, because I don't know how farmers feel about it if they get it in their farm, like their ponds. But so this is again something that's found within the study region I was working on in North Norfolk, and again has reduced, well, like so many species, has reduced in range over time, largely as a result of habitat loss and pollution. So potential again there for that seed bank to be buried in ghost ponds. So this is going back to the Nias marina, which I mentioned at the start as a plant of interest in that area, the holly-leaved naiad. This is pretty much only found in a few sites in Norfolk, mostly the Broads. But we managed to get it appeared in one pond, Pye's Pit, which we restored in February 2015, which is this one by itself over here. So it's not really found that nearby. We think it probably did come back from the seed bank, although we're not entirely sure. And again, this is another species that used to have a much wider distribution, so there's that potential to tap into it in those lost habitats. And finally, another one which we found nearby and has also popped up in 2 ponds after we restored them is another stonewort species, Tolipella glomerata, which is considered nationally scarce, and again it's mostly associated with sort of upland regions and low nutrient areas, not so much ponds, but we have got it in a few agricultural ponds in Norfolk. So again, another species that there's hope for in terms of bolstering that population from these old sites. So I guess as a conclusion, I'm not really sure how long I've spoken for, I haven't timed myself. Anyway, this is a nice photo from the inside of Ghost Pond 45, just to show it's a sort of frog's eye view of what it looks like after. So 1 year, this was a field 1 year before, and now it's a lovely, beautiful aquatic habitat full of broadleaf pondweed and chirophytes and sparganium in the emergence. So overall what we found is that ghost ponds can maintain a viable seed bank for over 150 years at least, based on just 3 ponds that we managed to get our hands on to actually do this experiment with. But resurrecting these ponds and restoring overgrown ponds, clearing out the old terrestrial sediment and exposing that seed bank, in both cases can result in those aquatic species coming back, and they both with restored ponds and ghost ponds seem to follow a similar sort of trajectory and pattern. You get these sites coming back very quickly within a year of excavating them, which is faster than you would expect with digging a new pond from scratch. And that these could therefore form a useful conservation tool in terms of not just bringing back lost habitats and reconnecting fragmented aquatic landscapes, but also reinstating those historic species and populations that were buried there in the past. I think that's it. I thought I'd leave you with a short quote from Darwin's Origin of Species, because I didn't realise until, I don't know what drew me to this, but Darwin was interested in pond seed banks as well. So he describes here taking 3 tablespoons of mud, keeping them on his desk for 6 months, and extracting over 500 plants from them. So just to show that the interest has been there for a long time, and although what we're doing perhaps with ghost ponds and looking at ponds that have been buried is new, there's certainly been a long history of interest in pond seed banks overall. Thank you.
Any questions for Emily?
Yeah.
This is a fascinating topic. I'm just curious if there's a story as to how you got interested in this.
So probably slightly by chance. So as Brian introduced at the start, I did my master's at UCL, and there was quite an emphasis on ponds. They were doing a lot of pond research already there, looking at existing ponds and how to preserve them, what role they have for bird populations. In the UK there's a lot of interest in declining farmland bird populations, so we were looking at insects coming off ponds and feeding farmland birds. And we started noticing that you could see all of these ponds that had been lost. And that was where we started talking. It was actually one of the farmers that we were working on his bird populations. He said, oh, rather than digging 1 million new ponds all over the shop, because there is specifically a project called the Million Ponds Project, who want to dig 1 million ponds by 2020. Anyway, so his philosophy was, rather than dig these ponds willy-nilly wherever in the landscape, you should go to where there used to be a pond, because where there used to be a pond not only will hold water, but you'll have all of those seeds and things there. So it was, Richard Waddingham was the farmer's name. It was essentially his idea that then got us thinking about it. And then we wrote a project on it based on that, a grant proposal.
Similar question. So, it sounded like you were working off some maps to identify the old ponds. Mm-hmm. Had you given much thought to how long they were there before they were filled, and what, similar to the 1 million ponds or whatever, how long will it take them to build up seed banks like these guys? Like, how long had they been on the landscape before they were filled?
It's a good question. It's quite difficult to tell. A lot of them had been around for over 100 years, definitely. The problem is, so sort of the Ordnance Survey level maps that we have drawn in the UK back to about 1890 record very accurately small features, like even individual trees, small ponds, trees, hedgerows. Prior to that, you went into the sort of realm of tithe mapping, where there was a lot more emphasis just on who owns what bit of land, and not so much whether there was a pond or a hedgerow. Unless it was a boundary, it's not necessarily recorded so well. So sometimes what you'll see, for instance, is, I know you might look at a map from 1830 and there won't be a pond, and then suddenly there will be a pond in 1890, but you don't really know if that's because it was created or just because it wasn't drawn previously. So some of them have got a written history, some of them have got names. So for instance, some of them you could trace back to being a clay lump pit, and it will say who dug it and how much clay they dug from it and which buildings it went into. So in those cases you can have quite a nice history of exactly who owned it and what it was used for. A lot of them, the origins are more confused than that. There, in the back.
I was wondering about the future of these. If they're on farmland, and is somebody going to be paying attention to them so they don't become overgrown like the ones that were overgrown? If the idea is to keep them open for those particular things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point, and it depends a lot on the farmer and who owns it and what they're interested in. So several of the people we've been working with are doing it for the love of, they like to see these habitats. They enjoyed pond dipping when they were kids, and they want to pass that on to, so it's sort of farmers who have an interest in having these little patches of conservation land there. Other sites we've worked with sort of much larger estates who you're perhaps less sure what's going to happen in the future. They're quite interested in having a bit of positive publicity in the short term, so they can say, we've done this conservation project. How well that will then is a question that we don't really know, to be honest. We're working, or I say we, I've left now, so I should say the team at UCL have been working on really trying to get ponds built more into legislation and farming agri-environment schemes. And we were making some headway with that, so that at least there would be some compensation, some incentive to keep ponds going on your farmland. since Brexit, who knows what's going to happen with any of that? So, good question. They could easily, when the UK decides it's going to go it alone and have to grow all of its own food, might fill all of these back in again. But I'm trying not to think about that. Yeah.
I may have missed this. Do you think birds spread species from pond to pond?
So yeah, there's been a fair amount of research on water birds spreading plants around. I'm trying to remember the names, but people used to go out and shoot a lot of them and have a look at their stomach contents and then grow the plants from see what could grow. So some plants benefit from being passed through a duck as well, it turns out, especially things with a hard seed coat. So they're definitely dispersal agents, yes. In landscapes like this, where you have lots of ponds, they do tend to hop around. So they do move stuff around quite effectively.
Two very quick questions. To what extent have you discovered anything new that you've never seen before? Any new species?
Ooh.
And number two, have you done any investigation into pollen to see what might have been there that you would not see there anyway?
New species? Unfortunately not. Again, I did only work on 3 ghost ponds, so I feel like there's still potential there, definitely. In terms of pollen, so there's another student at UCL at the moment, Richard, who's doing, he's doing current pollinator plant interactions, but he's been looking at the sediment cores I collected for pollen analysis as well to see what grew, what was there in the past. With ponds, the history is not going back very far, probably, in terms of the sediment record. So you're not going back thousands of years sort of through the Holocene with your pollen records, but you can get a short-term pattern probably.
Has there been any interest from geneticists or evolutionary biologists to look at the plants that are emerging from the 150-year-old seed bank and compare them to their modern descendants?
This is something I really want to look at.
Yeah,
So
we were
if anyone's
talking about this
interested, yes.
at dinner. Yeah.
It was something I really would have liked to have looked into because you've essentially got this time capsule, this buried, like something that's, and like I said, I mean, we may have only had common species coming back, but like you say, there's that pocket that's been sealed off for 150, 200 years. It'd be really interesting to see. I know there's been work done in Japan looking at, again, lake sediments rather than sort of ponds. Looking at allelic diversity in rare species from historic, in lakes where the species has become a tiny remnant population, looking back at the seed bank to see how that compares to what's left. So I think there's definitely potential to do that. I'm not a geneticist, but I'd love to know more if anyone wants to. Yeah.
You hinted at this a little bit, but I wonder if you could say more about how you find the farmer who wants to let you drag heavy equipment onto his potato field and dig
with
up
difficulty. So we tried various approaches. I put an ad, there's a paper in the UK called Farmers Weekly, which is pretty much what you'd imagine it is. And so one of the farmers who contacted us got in touch through that. He was just interested in conservation and he saw that and he thought, oh, I've got ponds, I'd like to see them restored. And so it's generally people who have got a strong interest in ecology or conservation, or people who have inherited a farm that's been in the family for many, many generations, and they like to preserve from the human side of it, preserve the landscape as it was when they. Wow. So those two sort of approaches were the people we encountered most. But since we've done this work and we've started taking more and more people on sort of tours around the farms to see how nice these habitats can become, more and more farmers are becoming interested, not necessarily people who have a really keen conservation interest, but I mean, although at the time dragging a digger across the field and so on seems a bit disruptive, these ghost ponds even, they tend to be patches that aren't very productive at all. They're patches that are already not much use to the farmer. So it's not so difficult. You're not asking for a prime crop producing area to be given up in the name of in the name of conservation. You're asking for a scrappy bit of field which they probably get sick of, like their tractor getting stuck in because it's too marshy for them to properly plough.
Thanks again, everyone. So we have